Good morning. Good to see all of you here today, this morning. Good to see some new faces here as well. So my name's Alex Dotson. I'm the senior pastor here at Vine Street Baptist Church, and we love seeing all of you here today. My wife is, again, not here. I know a couple people have been asking, where's the baby? Baby's at home trying to get some sleep along with his mother. So they're getting some rest. They're recovering still, but next week the baby will be here along with Grandma and Grandpa, who are supposedly coming down next weekend as well, because if it was up to them, they'd be down here every weekend. So next week we will get to see the baby, but this week they're at home recovering, but everything's going just fine thus far. So we thank you for all of your prayers and all of your support throughout this whole thing. So you can't tell, I am lacking in sleep right now for obvious reasons, okay? So I'm getting there, guys, but this is Oregon. I need my coffee too, okay? It's just how it is. Tonight we're going to be continuing on our study of church history, and we're going to be going through the ecumenical councils. If you don't know what that is, that's okay. Come tonight and you'll learn what an ecumenical council is. We'll talk about it. We're going to talk a little bit more about the importance of what we believe and why church history shows that it's important what we believe. So come tonight, come to our service tonight, and we'd love to see you here and to talk to you more about where did we come from. Today, if you turn with me to Luke chapter 5. Now today we begin right where we left off last week with Jesus and his disciples at this feast thrown by Matthew. And Matthew was throwing this big feast, and there were all these people coming from all around. Even the Pharisees and the teachers of the law came because they were curious about what's going on. They wanted to see what this feast was all about. Matthew was throwing this feast for Jesus because Jesus had actually reached out to Matthew. We remember last week we talked about Matthew. Matthew was this sinner, a tax collector, a traitor, someone who needed a life change. And Jesus, we remember last week what we talked about, Jesus has the ability and the authority to change people's lives for the better. And we see that in Matthew leaving his old ways behind to follow Jesus. And because of this, Matthew, now we see here, celebrates what Jesus has done for him. He wants to thank and he wants to show gratitude for what Jesus has done. And he throws this big feast for Jesus in celebration of what Jesus is doing and for what he's done for Matthew. And all these people that are around him are tax collectors and people who are not the most savory, but people who are amazed at this change in Matthew. And that's where we come today, right in the middle of this feast right here, starting in verse 33. Then they said to him, John's disciples fast often and say prayers, and those of the Pharisees do the same, but yours eat and drink. Jesus said to them, you can't make the wedding guests fast while the groom is with them, can you? But the time will come when the groom will be taken away from them, then they will fast in those days. He also told them a parable. No one tears a patch from a new garment and puts it on an old garment. Otherwise, not only will he tear the new, but also the piece from the new garment will not match the old. And no one puts a new wineskin into old wineskins. Otherwise, the new wine will burst the skins, and it will spill, and the skins will be ruined. But new wine should be put into fresh wineskins. And no one, after drinking old wine, wants new, because he says the old is better. So we come to this passage right here. Jesus was celebrating. Weeks ago we talked about Jesus calling Peter, James, and John, who were fishermen, men who were in need of a life change, men who left everything behind, just like Matthew, to follow Jesus. All of his disciples were here celebrating the changed life of someone else, someone they would eventually call brother. Now think about this for a second. Not long before, Peter, James, and John were of the same mindset as all these other people, everyone against these tax collectors, sinners, traitors. And yet, here those same people are celebrating what Jesus can do for people. And the rest of this crowd that's coming in wondering what's going on go up and they ask the question, why are you celebrating? There were others who questioned why they were celebrating. And our first inclination when we look at this passage, because we look at the passage previous and we see the Pharisees take a little bit of a point saying, trying to ask and trying to question Jesus, to try to pin something on Jesus here. But this isn't the Pharisees asking this question. We actually see from Matthew's own account in chapter 9, verse 14, that the people who asked Jesus this question right here are actually John the Baptist's disciples. They were asking a legitimate question because they were confused themselves. They were looking around going, why are they celebrating? What do we have to celebrate? They were openly questioning this because they were legitimately confused about what reason there was to celebrate, because they had spent their time with John fasting. And John, their leader, was in prison. What reason do we have to celebrate? John's disciples had been for a while looking for a new leader because John was in prison. Later on, we learn that John was actually executed for standing against Herod and for what he was doing wrong. Herod had him beheaded at the request of his wife and stepdaughter because they did not want John the Baptist speaking anymore. So John's disciples had been left without a leader. John's disciples were probably not feeling up to celebrating. They had been searching for Jesus, the one who John had told them, go seek this guy out. This is the one you need to go find. So they went to go seek out the one person that John told them to go find. They had spent their time with John fasting and praying in the wilderness with John. And they come to find Jesus. And what do they find? Jesus celebrating with his disciples. They go, what's going on here? Why are we celebrating? But they still don't get it. They don't get it. They don't understand who Jesus was and is. They still didn't understand that Jesus is different than John. That we're entering a whole new ball game here. You see, John said that he was not the Messiah. He said, I'm the voice of the one crying out in the wilderness, make straight the path for the Lord. John was not the Messiah. Jesus is. There's the difference. Jesus was different than John, but John's disciples still don't get that. John was just a spokesperson trying to prepare people for Jesus. John was trying to prepare his disciples for Jesus. That's why they were fasting and praying, because they were hoping for the Messiah, who is Jesus. But they don't make the connection. And so when they walk into this room and they see celebration going on, they don't get it. They've been fasting for so long that they figure that's the norm. That's what we should be doing right now. So when they walk into this room and they see everybody in this big party, of course the question's going to come up. Why aren't your disciples fasting? Our leader's in prison about to be executed. The whole state of Israel is in shambles when it comes to morality, and this whole system is just falling apart. What do we have to celebrate for? Why aren't your disciples fasting? Remember, we talked about fasting a little while ago. We said that fasting shows a humility before God. It shows sacrifice before God. It shows a trust in God for sustenance. It shows the need for God. John and his disciples fasted because they knew they needed something more than what the Judaism of the time was offering. They fasted because they were looking forward to what the plan of God was bringing. They fasted because they were hoping for God's plan to move forward, because they looked around them and they saw that they couldn't do this on their own. They needed something more. They needed the Messiah. And this is where the confusion comes in, because if they're all hoping for the same thing as Jesus and his disciples, why would Jesus and his disciples not be fasting? Why would they not fast and pray for the same things that they did? Why aren't they mourning over the failure of the teachers of the law, the failure of the Israelite culture to please God, the insufficiency of the sacrifices alone to provide a permanent offer of salvation? Wouldn't they mourn over what's going on and fast and pray for what is to come, that everything could be made whole again? Why are they celebrating? And that's when Jesus gives them an answer. And we see exactly the reason why they are celebrating. Jesus answers with this analogy where he tells the former disciples of John, they can't make a wedding party fast when they're with the groom. Now think about a wedding for a second. What is a wedding? Now I know some of you are preparing for a wedding. At its core, a wedding is a celebration. I've had to tell brides this sometimes because they forget in the midst of all this planning, in the midst of all this insanity, this is supposed to be fun. This is supposed to be a celebration. You're getting married. This is a great time. Have fun. It's one of the things my wife and I, when we got married, we committed to. We said, okay, we know that this is going to go south eventually at some point, that something we planned is not going to work. That's inevitable. So we're going to have the fun wedding. And boy, was it a fun wedding. It was a great time, folks. It's a celebration. A wedding is a party. It's a celebration of the old becoming new. Two people who were formerly single joining together into this new relationship of marriage. Now, obviously, one of the main people in a wedding is the groom. You can't have a wedding without a groom, obviously. In the culture during this time, the groom would throw a wedding feast, and in this feast was the celebration of this new life that the groom was bringing in. Now, think about this for a second. What if a wedding guest came into this feast that the groom had prepared and worked hard on, and had set aside his time to celebrate his wedding? All the wedding guests came in to celebrate, and someone spoke up and said, we can't eat at this feast. We can't celebrate with you. What would you think? Would you throw that person out? Absolutely. Get out. We're here to celebrate. Wouldn't that be disrespectful, though? It goes against everything what the celebration, what the feast is really all about. And what Jesus is saying is, you can't make wedding guests fast when they're with the groom at the celebration. When they're celebrating with the groom what's going on. And you can't stop the celebration when the groom is in the room. When the groom is there, they are celebrating his big day, his event. Why would you ruin that by going into a time of mourning, which is part of what fasting is? And that's what fasting really was in concerns to John's disciples. To John's disciples, fasting was a time of mourning and a time of looking forward, hoping for what was to come. But this is not a time of mourning. This is a time of celebration because the groom is right there in the room with them. And you can't stop a celebration when the man of the hour is right there in the room. But Jesus also says something else interesting that we'll come back to here in a minute. When the groom is not there, that's the time when people should fast. Because they're hoping for him to come back. They fast to look forward because they miss the groom, they miss being with him, and they want his speedy return. That's when people should fast. That's when people should be praying to God for the groom's quick return. It's only when the groom is not in the room that people should fast. And then Jesus goes into three interesting parables here. Starts out with this first parable that says, you do not take a patch of new garment and put it on an old garment. Why? Because putting a patch from a new garment onto an old garment ruins both. If you take a patch from a new garment and you cut out a patch, you've already ruined the new garment. That new garment's gone. But then you put in the old garment. And the new garment and the old garment have different coloring because one's old, one's new. We have a ladies' craft night here. My wife is a quilter. And I've seen some of the great quilts that some of you have made and some of the great crafts that you all have made. But let me ask you something. What if I told you to take a brand new piece of fabric and just cut into it? And then you take that brand new piece of fabric, really nice stuff, and you put it onto a quilt pattern where it doesn't match. What would you tell me? Would you tell me I've lost my mind? You just ruined the pattern from the old, and you ruined the new fabric. So why would you ruin a new garment by cutting into it and putting it on the old? If someone went out and bought a new garment, why would they keep the old one? The old one has not been sustainable. The old one has grown old. Why would they keep around the old garment? It doesn't make sense. It makes even less sense to take a patch from the new garment and put it on the old one when you have a brand new garment staring you in the face. So this first parable says it makes no sense for a new garment to be taken and cut in order to patch up an old garment that's gone through its time. You would, of course, just wear the new garment rather than ruin it. Then Jesus goes on to another parable. He says, no one puts new wine into old wineskins. Now, a wineskin is a leather pouch they would pour drinks in so they could travel around with. It's kind of like their version of a bottle. But in those days, there were leather pouches, maybe sealed at the top so they could drink as they go, but they would take these things. Eventually, obviously, they would get older as they were used more and more, and they would crack. So old cracked wineskins would not be able to take the new wine. The leather on an old cracked wineskin would not be able to last for the new wine. The old wineskin would burst because of the new wine. What do you have at that point? You have a burst wineskin. Can that hold wine anymore? Can that hold anything anymore? No. So that's completely useless now. And the new wine would be poured out onto the ground. Obviously, you don't want to slurp up wine from the ground, do you? No. So what do you have? Nothing. You don't have a wineskin, and you don't have wine anymore. So you don't put new wine into the old wineskins because the old wineskin would burst, and then you would lose both. You use a fresh wineskin for new wine because a fresh wineskin with new leather will be able to take the new wine. A fresh wineskin has the strength and has the capacity, it has the ability to carry the new wine. So you put new wine into a new wineskin, not new wine into old wineskins. Because the old wineskins would break, and then you would lose both. A new wineskin is able to take the newer drink that you're putting into it. And Jesus keeps on this imagery of wine here in this third parable. No one drinks new wine after drinking old wine. And if you know a little bit about wineries and vineyards, I know we're Baptists here, so we can't necessarily talk about drinking, but we're going to talk a little bit about wineries and vineyards here for a second, okay? Bear with me. If you know a little bit about wineries and vineyards, you know that old age wine always tastes better. And that's what Jesus is getting at here. Old fermented wine tastes better. It's been aged. It tastes better than the new stuff. Old wine tastes better than new wine because the new wine hasn't had time to mature. The old wine is better wine. It's a more quality wine. Jesus is saying that when you have two drinks, of course you're going to want the better of the two. People want what's better. They want the better wine. People need what is better. That's the whole reason for this right here. The new garment is better. The new wineskin is better. The aged wine is better. People need what is better. This is relating to the old ways versus Jesus being the new way. The old ways were not sufficient to provide a permanent offer of salvation because that wasn't the point. Even though that's what had been taught by the teachers of the law, by the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Sanhedrin. They had been teaching that the old ways were going to be sufficient, permanently to cover sin. That they could just go on as a theocratic Israel and please God. But it wasn't going to work. Jesus is making a metaphor for the old ways being completely insufficient, and for him being the sufficient new way that has fulfilled the old way. And that's the reason why they're celebrating. They're celebrating who Jesus is and what this is really representing. And why these people are really celebrating right here is because the better is right in front of them. The better is right there in front of them. So look at this passage. We wonder what exactly Jesus is meaning from these parables. Why doesn't he just tell them why they're not fasting? Remember, that's the beginning question here. Why don't your disciples fast like we do? He's trying to show them exactly what the real issue really is, because they don't get it. These sayings are something they can relate to, something that if they are in tune with their relationship with God, they should be able to pick up on. We go back to the reason for John's disciples in fasting and what the whole point of the old law was. The old law, the old covenant, Judaism that was set down for Israel to follow from God. We learn later on from Paul when he writes Romans that the old law was not meant to save people. The old law cannot save people. The old covenant cannot save. The sacrificial system was never going to be sufficient to completely cover sin. It wasn't permanent. Paul puts it this way. The old law was meant for one reason: to condemn. To condemn. The old law was not meant to save. It was meant to condemn people. It's the answer to all those people who go out there and say, if God would just show himself, then they would follow him. I've heard that multiple times in today's culture. If God would just show himself, then we would all follow him. But here's the problem. God's already done that. That's what the old law, that's the whole point of the old covenant and the old law. It was proof that humanity cannot, even with him right there in front of the Israelites, are unable to obey God and his perfect standards. People cannot follow the old covenant and the old law of Israel perfectly. That was the point of the old law, to show that we need God. God had to step in. The old covenant was meant to show people that they could not do this on their own. We cannot do this on our own. It was meant to foreshadow what was to come. It was meant to show people their need for him to be able to take care of this. Remember that humanity cannot cover sin because we're all guilty. We need God's help. The old law was meant to show people that they could not follow and be completely obedient to God on their own. We cannot follow God perfectly on our own to his standard. We can't. The old law, old Israel, old Judaism is proof that people cannot follow God perfectly. People cannot be obedient to God perfectly on their own. They can't. The old law was meant to show people their need for God, their need for something greater, their need for what was to come, their need for something better. When John's disciples are fasting, they were doing all these things because they were mourning for what had become of Israel. Even though the people had the old law and said they followed it, they really didn't. The moral corruption within Israel at the time was at an all-time high. The corruption, the hypocrisy, the moral decay of the people of Israel was not something God was pleased with. And John's disciples knew it. They were mourning for what had become of Israel, and they were hoping, looking forward for the Messiah to come to make things new, to make things right. And that's why they were fasting. John's disciples fasting because they were mourning over what Judaism had become and looking forward to when the Messiah would come around and give them something better. Bottom line, they were hoping for Jesus. The man they were hoping for, the Messiah, God incarnate, is sitting right there in the room with them. And they're asking the Messiah basically this: Messiah, why aren't you looking forward to the Messiah? Which is ridiculous, and we see it that way because they're asking this from the very person they're hoping for. But remember that Jesus was not completely declaring himself as Messiah yet. He had alluded to it, and we can put together the claims now as we see it, but the people didn't get it. Even Jesus' own disciples, it took them a while. Multiple times, it seemed like Jesus had to slap Peter upside the head because of his statements where Peter wasn't completely getting it himself. They were hoping for Jesus, not realizing that he was the one that John had foretold, that he was the one John was pointing to, that he was the one who was to be the focus of their fasting. That's why they're not fasting, Jesus and his disciples and these people, because Jesus is here. It's not a time for fasting because Jesus is right there in front of them. The one they're hoping for is right there in front of them. Jesus is the one who fulfills the old law. Now, don't completely sit here and throw the baby out with the bathwater. God's plan did not fail because the old law doesn't save. The 10 Commandments that God gave, summed up later by Jesus as, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself, is still very much the ways of God. The ways of God that we need to strive towards. But the point of the old law had been fulfilled when Jesus came. The old law was successful in its ultimate purpose, to show us our need for Jesus. The people of Israel did not realize, for the most part, they thought the law was the thing that was going to bridge the gap between them and God. They did not realize that the laws they put their hope in, the very covenant they put their hope in, was the very thing condemning them. Because without the help of God, without God's intervention, we cannot love the Lord our God with all of our hearts, minds, and souls. We cannot love our neighbors as ourselves. Without a better way, we cannot follow the 10 Commandments perfectly. Without God's intervention, we can't follow. We can't be obedient. Without a better way, we can't do it. We need God's intervention. And that's where the law points to our need for Jesus. God stepping in for us. Jesus is the one who fulfills and fills that gap between us and himself. He fulfills the law and makes that way for salvation for us. He is the groom. When Jesus spoke of the wedding and the groom in this feast, we need to realize that Jesus is talking about himself. The reason why his disciples are not fasting and why they're celebrating is because the groom is right there. The groom is in the room with them. The groom has come for them. This is a time of celebration. It's time to be happy, not a time to mourn. The new way, the better way, had come. Jesus gives 3 parables here to show that Judaism had fulfilled its purpose and the old sacrifices were no longer needed. Jesus had come. Jesus is the new garment, and old Judaism is the old garment. Jesus is the new wine, and old Judaism is the old wineskin. Jesus is the better fermented wine, and old Judaism is the lesser wine. Judaism was meant to point the way to Jesus. That's the reason there's no fasting here. Because Jesus is around. This was not a time of mourning. This was a time to celebrate because Jesus was with his people. And when he's with his people, there's no reason to fast. Because he's the new way that has been hoped for. Jesus is the new garment. Jesus is the new wine. Jesus is the better fermented wine. Jesus is the new life, the better way that everyone has hoped for. It was a time to celebrate because the new life that Jesus brought, that everyone had hoped for, had finally come. He was there. Jesus is the new way of salvation that they and we should put our hope and trust in. And now we are here today looking forward to the day when we are either with him in heaven or the day when he returns. Because we see in this passage right here, Jesus mentions it. He says, in the days when the groom is no longer with them, that would be a time for fasting. Jesus right now is physically not with us here on earth. But we know he's up in heaven, and we know he's still here through his Spirit. We know that he's still with us. Yet in another physical sense, Jesus is not here. And we are looking forward to the day when we are with him physically in heaven, or the day when he returns and we are physically with him here. Jesus tells them there's going to be a day where he's taken away, and that is a time for fasting and prayer. We are in a time where we need to be fasting and praying because we are looking forward for him to come back and come again. What's to come? What is coming? We are hoping to be with him again. We have the one, we know the one who brings a better life, brings a new life for us. And he brings us a life and prepares us a place with him. Jesus is the one who brings new life and a better way of living. And that's going to happen for all of those who believe in him. We will either one day be in heaven with him or see his second coming here on earth. For anyone who believes in him, those days are a day of celebration. That's why we fast and we pray today. Not out of a sense of mourning, but out of a sense of hope of what is to come. We are fasting and praying for Jesus' return, or fasting and praying in anticipation of being with him again one day in heaven. We place our hope in the new way that Jesus gave us ultimately through his death and resurrection. The ultimate sacrifice that the temple sacrifices were all foreshadowing to. A permanent sacrifice to make a permanent offer of salvation to anyone who will have faith in Jesus as the new way. And through that new way, we have hope that we will be with him. We place our hope in Jesus, who is the new way that John's disciples, that Israel hoped for. Place your hope in the new way of Jesus, in the better way of Jesus. The question I ask you today, do you want a better life? Do you want a better way of living? Because that's what Jesus brings to you today. Let's pray. Father God, we thank you for providing us with a way to be with you again. We thank you for your Son, Jesus. We thank you that through him we can be pleasing towards you. In your name, amen.